All eyes snapped to the entrance as a young girl stepped into the German Shepherd auction alone. The crowd's murmurs turned to stunned silence when she held up a worn photograph of a fallen police officer. What was she doing here? The secret she carried would leave everyone speechless. The auction hall was alive with murmurs and the occasional bark from restless dogs. Rows of kennels lined the room, each holding a German Shepherd up for bidding. At the far end of the hall, a young girl stood alone, her small frame dwarfed by the towering adults around her. She clutched a worn photograph in one hand and a folded letter in the other. Her hair was neatly combed, but her eyes betrayed a storm of emotions: grief, determination, and something more. The auctioneer's voice echoed from a wooden platform, announcing bids and closing sales. No one paid much attention to the girl at first. She was too young, too out of place. But those close enough to notice the photograph she held, a picture of a uniformed police officer smiling beside a German Shepherd, paused in curiosity. She glanced around, scanning the kennels, her lips pressed into a thin line. Somewhere in this room was the dog she had come for, the last connection to her father, the fallen cop whose story few knew. The girl's small frame wove through the maze of kennels, drawing curious glances from the crowd. Some whispered in hushed tones, their eyes tracking her determined steps. A few handlers exchanged puzzled looks. What was a young girl doing at a professional auction alone? Yet her face betrayed no fear, only a fierce resolve. She paused in front of one particular kennel, her breath catching. Inside stood a German Shepherd, larger than life, yet with an air of quiet strength. His ears twitched, his intelligent eyes locked onto hers. For a fleeting second, the world around them faded. It was as if the dog recognized her, remembered something beyond the metal bars that confined him. A nearby handler stepped closer, his voice low. "That one's a retired K9, he murmured, his tone tinged with curiosity. "Hard to handle, strong-willed. They say he used to work with a cop who—" He stopped as the girl glanced up sharply, her eyes gleaming with unshed tears. "I know," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump rising in her throat. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the kennel. The German Shepherd pressed his nose against her touch, a low whimper escaping his throat. The crowd around them fell into a hush. Even the auctioneer hesitated mid-call, sensing something different in this moment. The girl straightened her shoulders, stepping closer to the auction ring. She glanced at the photograph in her hand, then back at the dog. This wasn't just a random visit to the auction, it was a mission, and everyone watching realized it wasn't over yet. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium, his voice booming across the room as the bidding began. Lot 42, a prime working German Shepherd, trained in obedience and agility. The crowd stirred, eager buyers stepping forward with raised paddles, their offers climbing quickly. The girl stood frozen at the edge of the ring, her fists clenched, watching intently. She recognized the dog instantly. It was the same one from her father's photograph. His coat gleamed under the harsh lights, his posture poised and alert. Yet, as the handlers led him forward, the dog's eyes searched the crowd until they found hers. A quiet whimper escaped him, barely audible over the auctioneer's calls. 5,000, 5,500, 6,000, the auctioneer called, his gavel ready to fall. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped forward, her small voice trembling but firm. "I'll bid 6,500, she called, her face flushed with determination. A murmur rippled through the room. The auctioneer hesitated, glancing at her with a flicker of surprise. "Do we have 6,500? he asked, his voice echoing. For a moment, the bidding stalled. Then, from across the room, a new bidder, a tall man in a tailored suit, raised his paddle. 7,000, he said smoothly, his eyes glinting with challenge. The girl's heart sank, her pulse racing. She knew she couldn't compete with someone like him. Yet, as the German Shepherd shifted anxiously, his gaze never leaving hers, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about honoring her father's legacy. The auctioneer's voice faltered, sensing the tension thickening in the room. 7,000? Do I hear 7,500? His eyes flicked between the girl and the tall man, uncertain of how to proceed. The girl's pulse thundered in her ears, but her voice rang out clear and unwavering. 7,500, she called, her cheeks flushed with desperation. Gasps echoed from the crowd. The tall man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her determination. He glanced at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. 8,000, he countered smoothly, raising his paddle with a nonchalant flick. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. The girl's heart sank, but she squared her shoulders. She knew she had nothing more to offer. She clutched the photograph of her father tighter, her knuckles white against the worn edges. The image showed her father in uniform, one hand resting proudly on the very German Shepherd, now standing alone in the auction ring. She stepped forward, her voice breaking slightly. "That's my father's dog," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. A hush fell over the room. Even the auctioneer's hand froze mid-motion. The tall man lowered his paddle slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. She held up the photograph for all to see. "My father was Officer Greg Sanders," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He died in the line of duty last year. This dog, his name is Shadow, was his partner. They were inseparable. Shadow was retired after my father's death, and I thought he was placed in a good home. I just found out he was brought here to be sold. I can't let him go to anyone else." The room fell utterly silent. Even the German Shepherd, Shadow, seemed to sense the gravity of her words. His tail gave a tentative wag, his ears perked, and his body leaned toward the girl's outstretched hand. The auctioneer slowly lowered his gavel, his voice thick with emotion. 8,000 going once, going twice. The bid was about more than money now. It was about loyalty, love, and a bond that death couldn't sever. The air grew heavy with emotion as the auctioneer's voice trembled. 8,000, going once. The girl's hands clenched tightly at her sides, her eyes shimmering with tears. The tall man hesitated, his paddle lingering in the air, his brow furrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. But despite his deep pockets, something in the girl's voice had unsettled him. "I can't match that," she whispered to herself, her throat tight. Shadow whined softly, sensing her distress. His body pressed against the kennel bars, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that melted every heart in the room. The crowd, once fixated on the bidding, now watched in hushed reverence, waiting to see what would unfold. For a moment, it seemed the girl might be outbid, that Shadow would slip away into a life far removed from the one he'd shared with her father. The auctioneer's hand tightened around the gavel, ready to bring it down. But then, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "I'll cover the difference," it said firmly. All eyes turned. An older man, dressed in a worn police jacket, stepped forward, his voice cracked with emotion. "Greg Sanders was my partner. That dog saved my life once. He deserves to go home." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, some wiping away tears. The auctioneer hesitated, then nodded solemnly. 8,000, sold to the young lady with the hero's heart. The gavel struck. The room filled with applause, but the girl barely noticed. Her heart soared as Shadow let out a joyful bark, the reunion she had dreamed of finally within reach. The applause subsided into soft murmurs as the older man stepped closer, his police jacket catching the dim light. His face, lined with age and weathered by years of service, broke into a gentle smile as he reached out a hand to steady the girl's trembling fingers. "Your father was a good man," he said softly, and Shadow was more than just his partner. He was family. Tears filled the girl's eyes as she looked up at the man. She didn't know him, but something in his voice felt safe, familiar. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't have done this without you." The tall man, who had been outbid, watched silently from the edge of the crowd. His shoulders slumped slightly, and without a word, he turned and disappeared into the throng of onlookers. The tension that had filled the room only moments before slowly dissolved into a shared sense of relief and admiration. The older man gave the girl a reassuring nod, then turned his attention to the auctioneer. "Let's make sure the paperwork is done quickly. This dog belongs with her," he said firmly. The auctioneer nodded in agreement, his face softened by the emotional weight of the moment. As Shadow was led toward the girl, his tail wagged furiously, his ears pricked forward. The crowd watched in quiet awe as the reunion began, a living testament to loyalty, sacrifice, and love. The moment Shadow reached the girl, he bounded forward, his body trembling with excitement. His powerful frame gently bumped into her, his wet nose pressed into her trembling hands. The girl dropped to her knees, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck as sobs broke free. Shadow whined softly, his tail wagging in frantic, joyful circles. For a heartbeat, the auction hall faded away, leaving just the girl and the dog in a bubble of reunion. Passers-by wiped away tears, their whispers fading into silence. Shadow's coat shimmered in the light, and he pressed his head against her shoulder as if saying, "I'm home now." The older officer stepped back, giving them space, his eyes misty with his own memories of the fallen hero. "Your father would be proud," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the departing crowd. The auctioneer quietly gathered the paperwork, leaving it on a nearby table as a silent tribute to the reunion. As the girl finally stood, Shadow by her side, she looked down at him with a watery smile. "Let's go home, boy," she whispered. And together, they walked out of the auction hall, leaving behind the weight of loss and stepping into a new chapter, bound forever by loyalty and love.